bit too short, otherwise to have an eyesight line with all of you. Can you hear me well in the back?
Yeah, it's working.
Is it working? Can I use this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Turn it on.
And it comes out.
Is it?
Turn the other one off. Turn the lavalier off.
All right. Okay. Can you hear me?
Someone's going to come up. He's going to come up.
Okay, I'll do this with it.
He's an expert.
All right. Well,
Let there be sound.
that's proof that not all technological solutions come from the under 18. Okay. As you heard, I've been both a scholar and a practitioner in various parts of my life. I'm back in academic life, but watching very closely events unfolding in our part of the world. That's a term I'll come back to. I am somewhat resistant to the term Middle East, and I'll explain why as I go along. But I cannot speak to you today without mentioning that there's an Israeli election coming up in less than a month. It looks like a fairly dramatic race for a change because the current Prime Minister has a very formidable challenge facing him with the rise of a new center party, a centrist party led by a former chief of staff and two other former chiefs of staff and a very experienced political operator, Yair Lapid. So he's being seriously challenged. I'll try to avoid any descent into Israeli politics, but of course I'll answer questions if there's any. But I will say this, that the driving force behind the political disputes in Israel right now is not necessarily the Arab-Israeli, so to speak, the Arab-Israeli context or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but rather issues that have to do with the internal political dynamic, the probity of the Prime Minister. He's under a possible indictment, subject to a hearing which will take place after the election, on practices that some people deem, including the Prosecutor General, deem to have been corrupt, others dispute it. It's a very complicated set of issues that has little to do with Israel's strategic situation, which is, as it happens to be, my profession. And when I talk about the strategic situation, I have, let's say, under the subject or the title of this conversation today, I have bad news, good news, and what I consider to be very good news. So let me start with the bad news. The bad news is that a conflict resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, if that's still the proper term, is not on the immediate horizon. And with all due respect to the very hard-working team led by Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt, Ambassador Friedman and other American officials who have been very diligently trying to put together a proposition which may be on the table after the Israeli election, soon or after the election, or maybe they will wait until there's a coalition government formed. They call it the deal of the century. I doubt if it will actually take us to what we call in Israel, obviously, for obvious reasons, we cannot call this the final solution of the Palestinian-Israeli problem. So we call it a permanent status agreement. It doesn't look to be in the works for many reasons, including the fact that the Palestinians right now are carved right down the middle by two different governments. One in Ramallah, which is authorized under the Israeli Palestinian Oslo process, and one essentially a rebel Islamist, totalitarian Islamist government in Gaza under the Hamas organization, which hates their rivals in Ramallah and has no intention of submitting to their governance. They are playing all kinds of games about reconciliation and conversations and maybe some kind of civic functions, but they will never let their guns, Hamas will never let their guns be controlled by the Palestinian security forces from Ramallah, because they basically been busy killing each other now for the best part of 12 years, since Hamas violently took over in June 2007. And so we are talking about two rival propositions that make it very difficult for both of them to actually come to their senses and compromise on the essentials and make a deal, an agreement possible. So I'm afraid I'm not an optimist in this respect. However, I think, and in our organization, the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, we believe that conflict management, decent, intelligent, intelligence-driven, that's to say informed by very detailed and careful knowledge of what's happening on the other side, is actually something that we can, for the time being, sustain until the regional circumstances change and give us a shot at a permanent status agreement. Conflict management means that we have to go after the bad guys, and we know how to do that. And we do this very carefully and very selectively. It's always been my argument with my European friends. I tell them, look, you have Muslim terrorists acting in your countries. You don't want to be swept into a situation where you tag all Muslims, tar all Muslims with that brush. And you are right to try and avoid ever doing that. But in order to do that, you need to have what we have, which is a very finely developed intelligence capacity to tell the bad guys from the good guys and from those many in the middle who are trying to stay clear of violence. And I think Israel is fairly well equipped to go specifically in a discerning way after would-be attackers and perpetrators without going after the rest of the population. I think we've learned over the years how to do this carefully enough. So conflict management means we don't use a hammer where we can use a scalpel. It also means that we will take the necessary measures to ensure that no harm comes to our citizens, and that's the first duty of all governments. So we are talking about conflict management for the intermediate future, immediate and intermediate future, until things change sufficiently for us to take a different approach. That's not very heroic, it's not very encouraging, but it is, I believe, the better choice for the time being, vis-a-vis this swirling conflict between two Palestinian entities, both of which are still deeply committed to the proposition that we as a Jewish people have no business being where we are, which is a pity. Whenever we talk to them about Israel as, I would call it, to be specific, when we say Jewish state, it immediately gives rise to all kinds of confusions. You mean Jewish in what way? You mean Jewish in an exclusive way? Or, no, I would put it in a slightly longer bit of language, relying on Woodrow Wilson's concept. And I would say Israel is the embodiment of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. And we are asking, since we have already went much of the way towards recognizing the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. We're asking them to do the same in the context of a permanent status agreement. And the answer we get basically is, tough luck, there is no Jewish people. Judaism is a religion. And we say back, no. You've been with us now 100 years in conflict, you should know by now that, yes, Judaism is a religion, but the Jews are a people. When I talk to my Muslim friends, I tell them, why do we in the Jewish tradition, add 13th months, like this year, to our calendar, 7 out of 19 years. It's a calculus that was known already to the rabbis and the Greeks 2,500 years ago. And we don't just let our lunar year slide against the solar year the way the Muslims do. And the answer is very simple. Islam, like Christianity, is a universal religion. Doesn't matter where you celebrate it and in what climatic conditions. But Judaism has the 3 pilgrimages to Jerusalem, which are agriculturally conditioned. It's the religion of a people in a land. And so you have to keep the year, the month, in sync with the solar year. And that's to tell you that unlike universal religions, Judaism is the religion of a people. And as a people, we have come back now to our ancestral homeland, to which we have been committed all these years. And we are willing to compromise over what line of partition runs through that ancient land, on condition that the other side recognizes that we are there by right. And until that happens, I think we are going to have to face the challenge of conflict management. At the same time, as I said, there are good news, in a sense. And that is to say that what used to be called the Arab-Israeli conflict is really an irrelevant term anymore. Of the Arabs, the largest nation that speaks Arabic. I'm not even sure that they would really define themselves historically as having been Arab, but it used to be the leader of the Arab world. In many ways, it still aspires to that role, and that's the country of Egypt. And our relationship with Egypt today is by now so intimate that I resent the fact that the New York Times saw fit to tell the world just how closely we cooperate in military affairs. I wish I'm not saying they were lying, I'm just saying I wish they didn't. We face the same enemies. And we help. And interestingly enough, even President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt actually acknowledged this in a media interview, that there is now close military cooperation between our two countries. In 2 weeks, we shall be celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty signed by the late great leaders of both countries, Menachem Begin on our side and Anwar Sadat, who was assassinated 9 years later. 3 years later. But when he signed the treaty, or when he agreed at Camp David to the outlines of the treaty, he basically changed the course of history for our region. And today, Israel's border with our largest neighbor is a peaceful border. Our longest border is with the Kingdom of Jordan. Now we have issues here and there with the Jordanians, but our cooperation is close, intimate, complex, and by now, in addition to giving them more water than we are obliged to under the peace treaty, we are now becoming their energy suppliers as well. They've just signed on for a major Israeli and Jordanian agreement for the supply of Israeli gas from our offshore fields to Jordan. And they've gone through the numbers and they came to the conclusion that this is what they need for their future. Now with the Jordanians, it's a pretty remarkable relationship. I was telling this as a personal story to the kids this morning. I lost my father a few months ago, but 4 years ago, on my daughter's wedding, I invited the Jordanian ambassador, who was a personal friend of mine from close work together during my government years. I invited him to my daughter's wedding so I could get him together with my father, who was a POW in Jordan in '48, from the old city of Jerusalem. And then I said to my father, you didn't think when you were sitting there, by the way, they treated him decently. The Jordanians had British military commanders, British military training, and they were willing to abide by the norms of civilized society, unlike their Syrian neighbors or the Vietnamese or whoever. So he came back safe and sound, and I told him, you didn't expect 66 years ago you were sitting there in a tent in a POW camp in northern Jordan that the Jordanian ambassador to the state of Israel would come to your granddaughter's wedding. So clearly the landscape has changed. Even more dramatically, in the last couple of years, we've been seeing clear indications that much of the rest of the Arab world, or what I call, you've heard that I wrote a piece called The Game of Camps. It's obviously a reference to the Game of Thrones, only this one's not graced by cuddly dragons and benevolent blondes. But the Game of Camps in the region has created a camp of what I call the camp of stability. Pro-Western, stable countries, monarchies and others, who see eye to eye with Israel in terms of the common enemy. And that has meant, in recent years, that Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, less openly. Oman, quite openly. They hosted the Prime Minister for a recent visit. And others across the region, from Bahrain to Morocco, are basic, and the non-Arab Muslim country in sub-Saharan Africa called Chad, and others, are increasingly interested in a close relationship with Israel, whether it is overt or a bit less overt. It's not fully hidden anymore, and it's having an impact around the world. At the end of the day, I don't need a Saudi. Well, I would be very glad to see a Saudi embassy in Jerusalem or even in Tel Aviv. But what we really need from the Saudis is basically one thing. Israel today is a very significant economic player. We have more than $100 billion in exports a year. Our GDP per capita, I think even Ben Gurion would drop dead if he heard this, but we have surpassed Great Britain in GDP per capita. We are on par with Japan today. We still have a bit of catching up to do with the US, but we're working on it. People in Israel are complaining now that the prediction for 2019 is 3% growth a year. Most of our European trading partners would kiss their good luck, for 3% growth a year. So we are rising in the world, and we need to do business with countries like India. The standard joke is Israeli-Indian relationship is very important because together we constitute about 1/5 of all humanity. India, Brazil, under Bolsonaro's friend. Latin America, generally, the Prime Minister last year went to Mexico, Colombia, Argentina under Macri. Very different proposition than his predecessor, Kirchner, and so on and so forth. Africa, almost all African countries, now open to relations with Israel. Amazing new relationships with Vietnam, with the Philippines, all the very intimate relations with South Korea, with Singapore, across the world. And all of these countries no longer have to worry about how will the Saudis, with their hand on the spigot, on the oil spigot, how will they react to us being friends of Israel? Because that's no longer an issue. How will the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, react? Well, the UAE is almost openly favoring a major Israeli role in regional affairs. And you saw this if you watched the leaks from the recent summit organized by the United States in Warsaw. With the presence of Secretary of State Pompeo, leaders from much of the region, Arabs, as well as Prime Minister Netanyahu, around the same tables, speaking the same geostrategic language, and quite clearly facing the same enemies. Now, who are the enemies? Again, they say I could be here until tomorrow morning if I went into detail, but the enemy is not Islam, and it's not the Muslims, and it's not Islamic civilization. I spent much of my adult life in and out of uniform, in and out of government, telling people that the famous work by Professor Samuel Huntington of Harvard, The Clash of Civilizations, is a fascinating piece of work and dead wrong. It's not about Islam organizing as a civilization against the rest of the world. It's about elements within the world of Islam endorsing the totalitarian operational models that were offered in the 20s and 30s by Bolshevism and Nazism, redefining their religion in terms that are inspired by modern European totalitarianism, and then translating this into a political agenda. This is what you have today with Al-Qaeda and its infamous offshoot, the Islamic State, which is now dying in battle in its last vestiges in Syria, in Beirut. IS, people call it ISIS, it's a mistake. By the way, 3 reasons why ISIS is a misnomer. First, in Arabic, it is known as Daesh, Dawla Islamiyya fil Iraq wa Sham. Literally, the Islamic State in Iraq, that's fine, and Sham is an old Arab term, not only for Syria, but also for Lebanon, Israel, Jordan. In other words, what has been called in the West the Levant. And so the CIA and other agencies are right to call this ISIL, I-S-I-L, not ISIS. In any case, they've spread now beyond Iraq and Sham to other lands, all the way from the Marawi uprising in the Philippines to Boko Haram, the child abductors of Nigeria, and what they call a province or a terrorist organization that owes them allegiance in Sinai. These are the people that we and the Egyptians are fighting together, and so on and so forth. So they've spread beyond IS or IL, so I think the short term Islamic State is more accurate. And the third reason, by the way, I've heard from the Egyptian National Security Advisor, a very formidable woman. I was with her in a conference put together by Russia of national security advisors, and I was chosen as deputy to go there. It was in Ulan-Ude, near Lake Baikal. There's really nothing more exhilarating than going to Siberia with a return ticket. And there she was, and she said, "How can you call these people ISIS? This is the name of the Egyptian goddess of love." And they are a really nasty proposition. It's unbelievable. These are people who turned murder, rape, pillage into a kind of pornography of death and violence in order to entice a certain kind of souls from all over the world. And they found them, and I hope that very good care is taken not to ever allow these people to go back to their societies as if nothing has happened, given what they have been involved in doing. So ISIS is an enemy, or IS, or ISIL. The Muslim Brotherhood, a more sophisticated, a more patient version of Islamist totalitarianism. A version that learned, you know, like the Nazi Party in the 20s, or like the Bolsheviks in some places, learned how to use democracy to take over countries, which nearly happened in Egypt until I can never use the four-letter word here because that has implications under American law. So the Egyptian military stepped in and acted as a midwife to the people's will and removed them from office. And by the way, there really were millions and millions of Egyptians in the street 3 days before the military intervened, demanding the removal of the Muslim Brotherhood government. Hamas in Gaza is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Two important countries in the region support the Muslim Brotherhood. One is Qatar, with very, very deep pockets. You know, they own 1/6 of Volkswagen, all of Barcelona Football Club, which is religion to half of Europe. This obscenity of a piece of architecture called the Shard in London. And as the French say, now we know there is an Arab Spring because the Qataris bought Printemps in Paris. That's spring in French. It's a very, very famous department store. So the Qataris with their money and Erdogan, president of Turkey, is turning his country, which is still a member of NATO, away from the West and is turning it into a bastion of support for Muslim radicals, for Islamist totalitarians of the Muslim Brotherhood. Stripe of politics. That's a very serious development. That's bad news. The good news is that this is driving others to come to us, to join hands, facing the challenge. And this is not even the most serious challenge. The most serious challenge, unquestionably, for the immediate and intermediate future, is posed by the Islamic revolutionary totalitarian regime of Iran, under the supreme leader Ali Khamenei. Make no mistake about it. This smiling foreign minister of theirs, Zarif, and even their president, Rouhani, do not really govern the country. It's you make an assumption in America that if somebody's called president, he leads the country. No, he doesn't. He's more like, I would say, a French or Egyptian prime minister. There is a supreme authority, unelected and total, above his head. And that is the authority of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, the religious authority. And in fact, in Iran, if you do not subscribe to the notion that you owe total and unquestioning obedience to the supreme leader, that's known in Persian as velayat faqih, the obedience to the law interpreter, which is another way of saying to Ali Khamenei, and before that to Khomeini, if you still remember the hostage crisis and so on. If you don't offer your total allegiance to the supreme leader, you could be executed for it. This is a totalitarian system with some, let's say, democratic trappings allowed within a very narrow range of options. And they're using this very cleverly to hide the real nature of the Iranian regime and the real nature of the Iranian challenge from the world. But this is a nation of 90 million with a powerful industrial base, talented people, with a subversive program across the region. They have hijacked an entire country. I used to say the Palestinians invented the business of hijacking planes, or anyway took over that for a while. The Hezbollah, on behalf of Iran, went one step further and hijacked the country. The country of Lebanon is now held by Iranian agents. In Syria, it's Russia and Iran which saved Assad's smelly neck from the fate he deserved at the hands of his own people. And now it is left to us in Israel to try and basically get some sunlight between the Russian project and the Iranian project in Syria, which is the reason we are talking constantly, incessantly, to the Russians. And by the way, they agreed to have a hotline between our Air Force and their air command in Syria, so we can do deconfliction. That's a pretty amazing slap at Assad's face, because basically the Russians are saying, we know the Israelis will fly missions in Syria, we don't mind as long as we don't bump into each other. That's a fairly interesting twist of the story. But Iran is the other co-sponsor, and they intend to try and turn Syria into an Iranian operational base. They have a major subversive role to play in Iraq, and they are behind or deeply involved with the Shia uprising in Yemen, the Houthi uprising in Yemen. So when the Iranians are saying we are now in control of 4 Arab capitals, Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, Sana'a in Yemen, there is a ring of truth to that. And that's dangerous. And it will become far more dangerous if they get the bomb. And let me tell you, the Iranian program is a nuclear program is a military program. You don't even need to have the detailed intelligence we had, which became far more detailed recently last year when we stole the entire Iranian nuclear archive right under their noses from the middle of Tehran. I told people if anyone came to me with the script for a fiction film, I would have suggested that he, go a bit easy on his drinks in the evening. But this was what we did. Under the leadership of my former boss, Yossi Cohen, was my boss at the National Security Council, now head of the Mossad. Unbelievable story. But we didn't even need to do all this to know that this is a military program. And so the famous document, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. By the way, it's not an agreement. If it was an agreement or a treaty, President Obama would have been obliged to bring it to the Senate. He didn't have 67, he didn't have 50. He had 42 to prevent closure for a vote, which would have nixed that right there and then. He did not have a majority in any of the 2 houses of Congress to have this approved. He had the majority, the large enough minority to prevent it from being disapproved of. But it's not an agreement, and therefore President Trump could walk back from it without breaking any obligation. Now, that is a threat. And that document begins with the bold assertion of a lie, which is that the Iranian program is a peace movement. It's not. Its sheer size, which is very much like the size of the Pakistani military program, tells you that this is not it's too small to be civilian, it's too big to be research. It's not a cat, it's not an elephant, it's a horse, it's a war horse, it's never been anything but a war horse. So we face the challenge of putting an end to this, and the sooner the better. And finally, before we go to questions, I am also impressed by recent developments that tell me that we are not only finding allies and partners in our immediate region, we are basically beginning to redefine where we are in the world. As I said, I'm running a campaign against the term Middle East. The term itself is a historical reference, not a geographical one. It's a reference to the days when London ruled the world, London, Paris maybe, and you measured things in terms of their distances. There was a Near East. Ridiculously, they still call it that at the State Department. I mean, the nearest place east of the United States happens to be the islands of Bermuda, not Iraq. There was a Near East, which later was subsumed into the Middle East, which originally meant essentially Iraq and Iran, or what was then called Mesopotamia and Persia. And then came the very big Far East, And in the old British documents like the Anglo-Japanese Treaty of 1902, you find reference to the extreme east. That's just before you fall off. You know how you write China in Chinese? It's the center of the universe. They don't like being called far. You don't go very far if you call their part of the world Far East. And we are not in the Middle East. Israel is a Mediterranean country, an Eastern Mediterranean country. We have elements of our identity are linked up with that. Our culture. You know, the standard joke, what does it mean if you bump somewhere around in the world into a group of people, young people who look like Greeks but curse in Arabic? Israelis. We don't profane the Hebrew language, but we curse in English, Arabic, mostly Arabic, and a bit of Russian nowadays. So we have cultural affinities in the Mediterranean. But by now we also have commonality of interest. I can give you very quickly a list of what I call 8 E's that I gave in a recent presentation elsewhere. 8 things that begin with an E, that bring us together with the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Greeks, the Cypriots, Egypt, Jordan, Italy recently joined us in the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum. It's Egypt. We all worry about the future of Egypt. It's very important for us to keep Egypt stable. That's a long dissertation in a short sentence. Erdogan in Turkey, the man who's trying to change the balance of